In the ICU at UC Health in Aurora that night, machines breathed for me, while my husband leaned over my hospital bed and whispered into his mistress's hair, "When she is gone, we are going to get 2 million." The words slid out of his mouth like a promise, not a fear, not grief, not shock, a promise. I lay there trapped inside my own body, unable to raise a hand, unable to speak, unable to scream. He sounded excited. Kayla giggled a tiny sound with a sharp edge. She scrolled Zillow on her phone and showed him a penthouse in Lodo with glass walls and a rooftop spa. She whispered that it had perfect lighting for parties. Brandon murmured back that the view would make the new chapter worth it. He said our house in Central Park would sell fast because the neighborhood was in demand and the profit would look great next to the life insurance payout. I listened to them build my replacement life like it was already decorated, like my clothes were already boxed, like I was already a memory. Then came the worst sentence. Brandon said he wanted to change the furniture because everything in our house reminded him of a time he was forced to settle. Kayla brushed his arm and told him he had been patient long enough. She called my life insurance policy a safety net for people who did not know how to generate real money. She said it was poetic that a school teacher with a tiny salary would finally be worth something. I felt cold all over, even with warm air pumping through the ventilator tube. They did not whisper sorrow. They whispered plans. They talked about which realtor to use, whether they should list immediately, whether donations would get rid of my clothes faster. Brandon said he would keep my laptop because there were documents he needed. His tone changed only when the door opened. Nurse Clara entered with her clipboard checking my monitors. She greeted him, politely asked how he was holding up, asked if he needed water, then looked at me. Not the machines, not the numbers. Me. She noticed the single tear at the corner of my eye and dabbed it with a tissue. Brandon laughed a little too quickly. Reflex. Happens sometimes. Clara did not respond. She studied my face like she saw something real. Brandon pulled Kayla toward the hallway, telling her not to look nervous. When the door closed, Clara leaned over me so carefully I could smell the faint lavender on her scrubs. "Ariana, if you hear me, blink your right eye." My eyelid felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but I forced it down just once. Clara stopped breathing for a second. "Blink again." I did. That was when her voice changed. "I know you can hear me. You are not alone." My chest burned with the relief of being seen. She held my wrist gently and her voice dropped to a whisper so soft that no microphone could have caught it. I heard what they said. My mind screamed for help, for justice, for someone to stop them from turning my life into a bank transaction. She explained the communication board, the blink system, the steps, to show I was present. She told me she would not let anyone rush decisions. She told me she would watch Brandon. In the hallway, I heard his voice again bragging about the fast payout if things were handled correctly. He said hospitals like this were efficient when families wanted to move on. Kayla said funerals were unnecessary, that ashes could be scattered quietly. They sounded like two people ordering from a catalog, not planning a goodbye. Then Brandon muttered that my small teacher salary had kept him trapped for years, and that finally he could use money without explaining every purchase. My eyelids twitched with rage. For years I had budgeted saved coupon codes, packed lunches, and he had called it cute. Now he called it pathetic. He said the cash from the house, the policy, and my retirement would let him feel like a real man. He stood only feet from the woman he promised to love and planned how my death would buy him freedom. Nurse Clara returned, pretending to check my IV. She leaned close again. "If you want help, if you want justice, blink twice." I blinked twice. Hard. She whispered that she would stay on shift overnight. She whispered that she would call the doctor, check the records, and make sure nothing happened without confirmation. She asked if I had family. I blinked once for yes. She promised to find them. For the first time since the crash, something inside me shifted. Not fear, not sadness, something sharper. They thought I was gone. They thought a silent body meant a silent mind. They thought money made betrayal acceptable. but I heard every word. If you have ever been betrayed in a room where you could not defend yourself, if family betrayal has ever tried to erase your name, if a toxic family member ever treated you like a burden instead of a person, then you know that moment when your heart turns from pain to a quiet fire. I was still here. And if you are still here with me, if you feel what I felt in that room, type "I hear you." Because my story was not ending. It was just beginning, and quiet justice was coming. 6 to 12 months before the night I woke in the ICU, life in our house in Central Park looked normal from the outside. Neighbors waved sprinklers, clicked across the lawns, and our porch lights glowed like every other family on the block. On the inside, things were quieter in a way I could not explain at first. Brandon was not violent or loud. He was polite in public and controlled in private, the kind of man who could look perfectly reasonable while he chipped away at someone. I was a fourth-grade teacher who packed lunches, wrote lesson plans, and tried to stretch every paycheck. Brandon liked to call my salary humble. When friends asked how work was, he would say that my income was cute, the kind of money that bought scented candles and teacher mugs. He said it with a smile, and everyone laughed, but I felt smaller every time. One evening after school, I came home to see him scrolling through bank statements. He pointed to a grocery receipt and asked if I needed to buy brand name cereal. He showed me our subscription list on his laptop and said that if we wanted to be responsible adults, we needed to cut Netflix and the apps connected to my card. The next week, he drove home in a newer truck with shiny rims. He called it a business expense. I asked how we could afford it, and he said a man needed proper tools to work. When I reminded him we had agreed to wait, he told me I did not understand how money worked in the real world. That was the moment I noticed the pattern. When money left his hands, it was strategy. When money left mine, it was waste. He began taking Kayla to dinners with potential clients. He claimed she was there to assist with presentations and note-taking. I did not like how often he said her name, but I tried to trust my husband. The first time I felt truly invisible was at a dinner he hosted in Rhino. I arrived early because he said it was a casual event for networking. When I walked into the restaurant, he looked surprised. He pulled me aside and whispered that these clients needed a specific image, and I was not exactly aligned with the vibe. I asked what that meant. He told me I should head home and rest because teaching must be tiring. I left with a knot in my chest. Later that night, I saw pictures online of the same dinner. Brandon sat at the center of the table. Kayla wore a red dress and smiled like she belonged in his life more than I did. The next morning, he apologized without apology. He said couples who rush their emotions looked immature in public. When I told him that it hurt, he kissed my forehead and said not everything was about feelings. A few weeks later, he asked me to look over paperwork. He said we needed to update our financial safety plan. He had printed a stack of forms that looked official. He pointed to my life insurance policy and said it was good, but we should tidy the documents in case of emergencies. He asked me to sign a medical power of attorney telling me that if anything happened, he needed full control to avoid red tape. He used phrases like grown-up responsibility and future-proofing. I trusted him. I signed. The policy stood at $2 million with me as the insured person. My retirement account was modest, around $220,000, but it mattered to me. Our house had no mortgage. It was the only financial decision I was proud of because we had worked for years to pay it off. I thought we built a life together. Brandon said all these things needed to be streamlined, and he acted like he was helping us stay safe. I did not know that every signature gave him more leverage. In those months, he began asking about who paid which bill. He laughed when I used coupons and said it was funny watching me stretch pennies. When I tried to protect my dignity, he told me couples needed honesty about money. Yet every time his card swiped for golf memberships, tool upgrades, dinners, or drinks, he said the return on investment would show later. When I mentioned my classroom supplies that I paid for on my card, he told me that charity work was a hobby, not a necessity. The most painful part was how calm he sounded. He never shouted. He simply rearranged our world until I could not tell which decisions were mine and which were his. Money changed the rules in our house. Whoever paid decided. Whoever earned more decided. My salary was labeled emotional spending. His spending was labeled progress. The night I realized something was seriously wrong happened after a quiet dinner. He sat across from me and spoke about updating beneficiaries. He said a spouse should always have full rights because separate accounts created distance. He placed the papers on the table and asked me to sign them to keep our marriage solid. His voice was gentle, and he thanked me for understanding. I believed him because marriage is built on trust, and I did not want to become a suspicious woman who questioned everything. I signed. Later, I saw him slip the papers into a drawer and smile to himself. Not a happy smile, but a satisfied one. It felt like a lock clicking into place. That was the seed of injustice. He planted it slowly, a comment here, a receipt there, a rule about subscriptions, a suggestion that I stay home, a joke about my salary. Little bills became proof of who mattered. Little accounts became proof of who had power. I told myself this was marriage, that couples struggled, that men sometimes carried the financial load differently. I did not see that he was building control, one small choice at a time. If you have ever felt someone tighten their grip without raising their voice, if you have felt your confidence shrink under polite pressure, then you know what those months felt like. This is where my quiet fire began, where family conflict turned into something darker, and where a simple signature turned into the start of my revenge emotional journey, though I did not know it yet. June arrived with warm evenings and long sunsets, and for Brandon's birthday, he booked a rooftop restaurant in Lodo. He claimed it was a relaxed event, nothing formal, just friends and a few business contacts. I dressed simply thinking it would be a normal celebration between married adults. When we stepped out of the elevator and the skyline opened around us, I saw it immediately. The tables were filled with people Brandon wanted to impress, and he acted like a man hosting a show. Everyone laughed at his jokes and leaned in when he spoke. I stood beside him with a polite smile, trying to be supportive, trying to blend in. When one of his friends raised a glass, he joked that Ariana was like the team's sweet mother. He said it lightly, but everyone heard the implication. I was nurturing, gentle, quiet, and not quite on their level. Kayla responded with a smile that felt sharp. She told the table that I was sweet too sweet, and that sweetness was lovely at home, but did not match the speed of the market. Laughter rose from the table. I felt my skin heat, but Brandon squeezed my shoulder like he was comforting me for being out of place. He whispered something about how people did not intend to be rude. I did not say anything. Later in the evening, I walked toward the hallway near the restrooms, and as I passed the bar, I heard Brandon speaking to Kayla. He called her my star. His voice was soft and familiar, the kind of voice he used with me years ago when we were younger, and everything felt possible. Kayla smiled and told him he deserved someone who understood his ambition. She said that pretending to be small would hold him back. He told her there were big plans coming. He said the condo deal in Lodo was the first step. New space, new life, no need to bring unnecessary weight. Those words sat in the air like stones. I turned away before they saw me. When I returned to the table, a server placed champagne in front of Brandon. He tapped his glass and gave a small toast. He thanked everyone for believing in him and said his next chapter was about freedom and opportunity. People clapped. I sat quietly. When cake arrived, guests took photos. Someone pulled Brandon and Kayla together for a picture because they looked like a great team. They posed with arms close and smiles bright enough to fit any advertising campaign. After dessert, guests mingled near the railing. I stood apart for a moment, watching the city lights stretch across Denver. The air smelled like grilled steak and perfume. I told myself I was overthinking everything, that business partners get close, that jokes can hurt without meaning harm. Then Kayla pulled out her phone and opened a photo album. Someone beside her leaned in and said they looked cute in the hotel lobby. The screen glowed, and for just a second I saw a picture of Brandon and Kayla in a hotel hallway, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. She noticed my eyes on the phone and quickly tapped the screen, pretending to close the image. Her smile tightened. She said it was from a business trip, nothing important. She spoke too fast. A few hours later, people posted birthday stories and tagged Brandon. I clicked through them out of habit, wanting to see memories. Then I saw it. One of his business friends had filmed a group selfie, and for a split second in the corner of the frame, I saw Brandon and Kayla standing close, holding hands under the tablecloth. It was quick, so quick that most people would never notice, but I saw it. I replayed it, paused, then replayed again. My heart dropped. The video was public. It did not break any law to save it. With my thumb, I pressed the screen capture button. The image saved to my gallery. That was my first small step, a tiny act, quiet but sharp, a reminder to myself that I was not imagining things. Brandon finished the night surrounded by guests. He walked me to the car and said the evening was a success. He asked if I had fun. I told him the food was good. Inside, I felt like glass. On the drive home, he talked about investments and future deals. He said a penthouse in Lodo could become a real asset, something to show people who doubted his potential. He said some people are better with business than others. He said change was coming, and he sounded excited. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights. I thought about the picture in my phone. I thought about his voice calling her my star. I thought about the laughter at the table and how quickly people believed I was harmless. The humiliation settled into my bones. That night I showered and lay awake while Brandon slept soundly. The capture of that image sat silent in my phone like a seed waiting for the right season. It was a small beginning, a soft step into a path I had never walked before. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and felt invisible, if you have ever watched someone you loved act like a stranger, then you know how that night felt. It was the first drop in a long fall. It was the moment when humiliation slipped into clarity. It was the moment something inside me whispered that I needed evidence, not emotions. And for the first time, I listened. July and August came with heat and bright mornings, and from the outside, our house still looked like a peaceful place, with trimmed hedges and a flag fluttering over the porch. Inside, Brandon talked more about responsibility and discipline. One Saturday, he sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open and called me over with a serious tone. He said couples who acted like adults needed clear budgets, so he downloaded a finance app and entered every number from our accounts. He assigned categories for groceries, fuel, utilities, and then he created a section labeled Ariana Personal. He typed $60 per week. He said that amount covered everything I needed, and anything more would strain us. I stared at the number while he tapped his pencil on the table like a professor waiting for a student to understand. When I asked why it was so low, he said teachers needed structure and that money should not be wasted on comfort purchases. The next week, he paid a deposit on a golf membership. He wore a new polo shirt and called it a business networking tool. When I asked how a deposit fit into our budget, he smiled with the same calm voice he used whenever he wanted to make me feel foolish. He told me that I confused expenses with investments. Later, he scrolled through our subscription list again. He asked why I needed music streaming and a recipe app. He opened the settings and canceled everything attached to my card. He said we needed to preserve cash flow. On the same day, he ordered new golf shoes. I paid attention to the pattern, but I stayed quiet. It was easier to keep peace. A few days later, he asked if my paycheck could flow into our joint account for a while. He said this would make bill paying easier and help us manage debt. We did not have any debt, but he said it like a fact. I reminded him that my salary had always gone into my own account and that we both contributed to household expenses. He framed it as a temporary adjustment. He told me women who tried to hide their income looked immature. He said trust required transparency. He said a married couple should share everything. His words sounded reasonable, and his voice was gentle. The next morning, I filled out the direct deposit form. When my paycheck arrived 2 weeks later, the balance on my personal account stayed the same. I stared at the empty space on the screen and felt something crack. I asked if we could talk about it. He told me not to turn basic budgeting into drama. He said if I needed coffee or gas, I should just ask him. He offered to transfer money whenever necessary. His tone changed from persuasion to control without raising the volume. A A few days later, I saw his phone face down on the counter while he showered. A notification flashed. I did not mean to read it, but the words lit across the screen. "We will be free soon." The sender was signed with a single letter, K. My chest hurt. I picked up his phone, but the message disappeared after 10 seconds. The preview erased itself. He must have set it to auto-delete. I froze, breathing slowly, and then I opened the camera on my phone and recorded his screen in case anything else appeared. 10 seconds later, another notification popped up. Planning the next chapter, same initial, same tone. It disappeared again. My heart raced. I replayed the recording. The proof was blurred, but the words were there. I saved it to a hidden folder. That night at dinner, I watched him cut his steak while he talked about good decisions and future goals. I nodded and smiled because arguing would only make him call me emotional. When he left for a late meeting, I sat alone in the quiet kitchen. I opened my laptop and searched for local credit unions. I found one that offered free checking with a simple application. I filled out the form, created a login, and within minutes I had an account that only I knew about. The next morning, I opened our payroll portal from my classroom computer and set a small portion of each pay period to transfer automatically into the new account. The amount was tiny enough that Brandon would not notice, but meaningful enough to remind myself that I was not invisible. It was the first step back toward myself. A few days later, he asked me to install the budget app on my phone so we could track spending together. The app showed colored bars. His categories filled with bold green numbers. Mine stayed near 0. He pointed to a tiny red bar next to my name and asked if I had used too much gas this week. I told him school was farther than usual because of summer workshops. He raised an eyebrow and said excuses were things children used. I clicked the app closed. Inside, I was burning. He no longer treated me as a partner. He treated me as a student who needed correction. He began telling people that I was careless with money. He told his friends that he was teaching me how to manage finances like an adult. Every time I packed lunch or used a coupon, he laughed softly and said scarcity mentality belonged to small thinkers. Yet he never refused the meals I cooked or the savings I made. One night, I found a receipt on the counter. It was for a weekend at a downtown hotel charged to his business card. He said it was part of a networking event. I asked how long it would last. He answered that adults should not need permission to work. When he walked away, I looked at the total and felt dizzy. I stared at my hands and realized I was shrinking without noticing. He was deciding who I could be. I sat down and wrote every detail in a notebook. Gaslighting looks like reason on the surface. Control looks like organization. Dismissal looks like calm advice. I promised myself I would not ignore what I saw. I backed up the screen recording to a private drive. I copied receipts. I took pictures of the deposit slip from his golf club. I gathered everything slowly, quietly, carefully, because money had become the weapon he used and evidence would be the answer. If you have ever watched someone rearrange your life until you felt small, if you have seen a partner speak to you like a coach, correcting a child, then you understand these months. They were the loops and turns before the fall, the slow tightening of invisible ropes. I did not fight yet. I simply waited, watched, and prepared. Quiet steps can become loud later, and no one suspected a thing. Early September felt like the city had tilted, and I was the only one who noticed the angle, because every conversation slid toward money and control, and then toward my place in the room, which kept shrinking until there was barely space to stand without apology. And it began on a Sunday patio brunch with Brandon's friends, where the waiter poured coffee, and the sun was clean and bright, and Brandon told a story about a client rescuing a failing deal, and then turned to me and said in front of everyone that I did not understand money and that he carried the weight for both of us, and the table laughed, the soft, polite laugh people use when a joke is mean and they do not want to admit it, and I felt heat climb my neck and said nothing, because to defend myself would make me look dramatic. And after the plates were cleared, he leaned close and said I should sit out a major client event that week because I tended to make things awkward by asking practical questions and that executives preferred light conversation and sparkle, and that Kayla would be there because she was great with tone. And I stared at him and said I was his wife, not a prop, and he said exactly. And that was why he wanted me to be comfortable at home, where I could relax and not worry about shoes or small talk, and he kissed my cheek as if he had done me a kindness and walked away to settle the bill like a hero. And 2 days later, he came home and opened the jewelry box on my dresser and said we needed to rotate assets because cash flow mattered and that the anniversary set could be sold and later repurchased when markets were stronger. And I said the set was not an asset, it was a memory. And he said memories do not pay for expansion. And I reminded him our house was paid off and we had no debt, and he said growth needs oxygen and we were wasting air. And that week, he listed the necklace through a broker downtown and handed me a receipt and told me to feel proud for supporting his momentum. And I went to school with a sick stomach, and at lunch, I scrolled through social media and saw a photo from a gallery preview that Kayla attended the night before. And in the second frame, she turned her head and the camera caught her profile. And my breath stopped because the earrings glinting in that light were the same cut and setting as mine. And maybe they were a coincidence, and maybe the world is full of identical stones, and still I knew. And that afternoon, the humiliation ripened into something firmer, like a core. And I wrote the broker name into my notebook with the price and the date, because details matter when people pretend you are imagining things. And that evening, Brandon rehearsed for his big event, pacing in the living room, practicing lines about leadership and lean teams. And he asked if I had prepared a simple dinner because heavy food slowed him down, and I told him there was baked chicken and rice. And he looked pleased and told me again to skip the event and spare myself the tension. And when he left, I stacked the plates and breathed the quiet air of a house that kept erasing me, room by room. And I moved through each space and touched our things and reminded myself I existed, even if someone preferred I did not. And later that night, while I folded laundry, my watch buzzed with a mirrored notification from his phone, because months earlier he had linked my devices so he could approve family app purchases. And now a message flashed across my small screen from a contact saved with only the letter K, and it read, "When she is gone," and then the rest of the sentence slid away as the auto-delete wiped it, and my hands shook, and I pressed the side button twice to grab a screen recording, and the next message arrived and said we can list in 2 weeks once the papers are ready, and then vanished, and I saved the clip and backed it to the private drive. I set up in August and labeled the file with the date and time, because evidence needs order. And the next morning, he complimented my coffee, like we were fine, and told me he had a surprise cleaner coming on Friday as a treat for me. And I smiled and said I would handle the scheduling, and he looked grateful and left for a meeting. And as soon as the door shut, I booked a deep cleaning with a company I trusted and wrote explicit instructions to clear and sort Brandon's drawers and shelves, and to place anything purchased with my card into separate bags with printed labels. I prepared at school that read, "Paid by Ariana, not business." And when the team arrived, I guided them room by room with a careful voice, and it felt almost funny and a little savage to watch neat stacks of golf gear, cologne bottles, watches, and upgraded chargers slide into bags marked by receipts with my name on them, and I did not throw anything away because I was not reckless. I simply reclaimed what I had purchased and left his true business items exactly where they belonged. And when Brandon returned, he saw the organized closet and said it looked like a magazine spread, and asked who had thought to label the bins. And I said I like to keep costs transparent, and he froze for a second and then smiled because control hates humor and does not know what to do with it. And 2 days later, he dressed for the client event while I sat on the couch grading spelling tests, and he told me he needed me to respect boundaries, and I told him I respected truth, and the room cooled. And he left with Kayla, and I watched a live clip posted by a guest, and the camera panned and captured them entering together. And I pressed pause and stared at the way his hand hovered at the small of her back. And then my watch buzzed again later that night with a calendar alert that his assistant had synced, and it showed an early morning meeting at a realtor office I recognized from the listing tags, and I lay awake and counted the small insults that had been presented as guidance, and the public jabs that had been framed as jokes, and the demands to sell memories that had been sold as strategy, and inside that, counting, I felt steadier, and when he came home near midnight with the smell of whiskey and applause clinging to his jacket, he said the night was perfection, and that he had never felt so understood, and he thanked me for staying out of the way, and I smiled and said, "You are welcome." And he blinked as if he had heard something under the words, and then looked away because he preferred noise to meaning, and as he slept, I opened my notebook and wrote the date, the time, the messages, the jewelry, the labels, and the simple truth that humiliation had become a map, and I was following it carefully, step by careful step. October 15th arrived with a gray sky that pressed low over Denver, and the rain came down in sheets that blurred headlights and turned the freeway into a ribbon of trembling light. I stayed late at school preparing report cards, and by the time I walked to my car, the lot was almost empty. The wipers swept furiously as I merged onto I-225, and every mile felt heavier than the one before. Brandon had spent the morning lecturing me about the cost of school supplies and said I should learn to stop acting like a charity worker. His words stayed in my head like stones. As I drove, my chest ached the way it does when a thought refuses to leave. I took the ramp toward I-70 and eased my foot on the brake for the curve, but the pedal smacked against the floor with no resistance at all. The world tilted. The tires skidded. A scream built in my throat, but the rain swallowed the sound. I gripped the wheel with both hands. The car spun across the wet pavement as if it had been pushed by invisible hands. Metal shrieked as the guardrail rushed toward me. The steering wheel trembled, shaking my bones, and I yanked it to the right as hard as I could. For a second, I saw the flash of another car's lights wide with panic. Then the world slammed sideways. The airbags burst open with a choking, powdery smell, and my head snapped back. I remember the taste of blood on my tongue and the muffled thud of my heartbeat in my ears. The window cracked like ice. Everything slowed and then stopped. Rain tapped the broken glass. The horn blared in a long, awful cry that faded into silence. Darkness wrapped around me, warm and heavy. When I woke again, I was not in the car. A ceiling of bright white lights hovered over me, and a rhythmic beep marked the shape of my heartbeat. Voices floated around me, distant and warped like underwater echoes. I tried to speak. Nothing came out. I tried to move. My body refused to answer. Panic crawled across my ribs, but even that felt muted, as if I were screaming inside a stone shell. A doctor said I had a concussion and several broken ribs. Another voice spoke about swelling in the brain. Someone said critical. Someone said monitor, and then I heard Brandon. His voice sounded thick with tears. He told the nurse he was devastated. He said he could not live without me. He brushed my hair back from my forehead, and if I could have opened my mouth, I would have believed him for one small second, because grief sounded real in his voice. The nurse told him I could still hear people even if I could not respond. He squeezed my hand and whispered that he was praying. The staff left the room and his breath changed. He stood up. I heard his phone unlock with a soft click, and then his voice sharpened, clear and cold. He said 30 days payout. He said the policy timeline was straightforward. He said everything would be clean. My heart hammered, and the machines beside me recorded it with relentless honesty. He spoke with someone who did not need introductions, because he skipped greetings and spoke in the tone of a man updating a business partner. He said she will not come back from this, and if the doctor suggested withdrawal, they should not delay. He mentioned the house and the condo builder who could start sooner if he moved fast. He used numbers instead of feelings. He ended the call without a goodbye. The door opened again. The nurse returned. Brandon put his face in his hands and forced a sob. She placed a cup of water beside him and told him to rest. He thanked her in a shaking voice. The moment she left, his breath steadied. That was when the truth hit with full force. He was not waiting for me to heal. He was waiting for paperwork to clear. He sat in the chair beside my bed, scrolling through his phone. I heard him type. I heard him whisper. He said, "We will be free soon." My eyes stung behind the lids. Inside my head, I screamed, but my body stayed still. The doctor returned and explained the severity of my injuries. He mentioned the possibility of temporary locked-in syndrome. Brandon asked how decisions would be made if I could not recover. His voice was calm, too calm. The doctor said the next 48 hours were critical. Brandon asked if family could sign consent to withdraw if there was no improvement. The doctor said it was too soon to discuss. Brandon nodded and thanked him with the politeness of a man ordering dessert. The nurse adjusted my blankets and told me I was safe. I believed her voice, not his. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt like a blur. At some point, he stepped into the hallway and spoke into his phone again. He said the brakes failed and that accidents happen in bad weather. He sounded rehearsed. The nurse returned and checked my vitals. She whispered that she had seen patients fight their way back from worse. I wanted to grab her hand. I wanted to blink or breathe differently to show her I was there, trapped inside my silent body, desperate to be heard. The night deepened, and the machines kept me alive. Brandon told someone over the phone that insurance investigators rarely questioned weather accidents. He mentioned the words payout and timeline again, quietly, quickly, coldly. Attempted murder was a phrase I could not say, but the shape of it formed inside my mind. A story financial motive was unfolding around my unconscious body. The rain kept falling outside. The hospital lights hummed. I lay there listening to the man who had promised to love me count the days until I became a check. 3 days after the crash, the world around me existed in sound and pressure, and pain without movement. My body was a silent room I could not leave. I heard the doctors speak in calm voices. I heard machines hiss breath into my lungs, and I heard the heavy shuffle of shoes on the tile. At first, I focused on every beep, counting them as proof that I was still alive. Time did not move with minutes or hours. It moved with visitors. Brandon arrived each day with practiced grief and an audience of nurses who felt sorry for him. He would sit beside me, hold my hand, and speak to the staff about how much he loved me. They believed him. He sounded gentle. He sounded loyal. But when the room emptied and the hallway around us went quiet, his voice dropped into something colder. He whispered that the process should not drag on. He asked how long hospitals waited before discussing withdrawal. He asked about protocols for families who did not want suffering to continue. The doctor told him again that progress could come slowly and that swelling sometimes decreased after a week. Brandon nodded with polite disappointment. On the 4th day, Kayla visited. Her heels clicked on the floor like knives. She stood near the window and spoke in a syrupy whisper. She said the penthouse downtown had a bathtub with a view of the stadium. She said game nights would feel like private concerts. Brandon told her not to say those things here. She laughed and said patients in my condition did not notice. My heart cracked once, then twice. I cried, but the tears could not fall properly. They slid across my temples into my hair. Kayla walked closer, studying my face like I was an object left behind. She asked if hospitals donated belongings from patients who never woke up. She spoke softly, but her words carried the weight of someone who had practiced this conversation. Brandon told her to be patient, that paperwork required precision, and that once things were finalized, they would leave this house and this life behind them. He said moving fast meant fewer complications. The machines kept breathing for me. The room felt colder. When they left, Nurse Clara came to check my vitals. She wiped a bit of moisture from the corner of my eye and paused. Something in her silence shifted. She looked closer, leaning in until her face filled my blurry peripheral vision. She whispered my name, not like a test, but like a promise. Ariana, if you hear me, I am here. Blink if you can. I pushed at my eyelids with every ounce of will inside a body that refused to move. For a moment, nothing happened. Then my right eyelid shivered once. Clara's breath caught. She asked again, Blink if you hear me." I blinked twice. It was small, invisible to anyone not searching for hope, but she saw it. She placed her hand over mine and whispered that she knew I was listening. She told me she would not let anyone rush decisions. She said she was going to help me speak without a voice. Hours passed before she returned with a letter board and a plan. She explained that she would point to rows of letters and I would blink when she reached the one I needed. It was a painfully slow system, but it meant I could speak again in fragments, in pieces, in tiny sparks of truth. When she tested it, I spelled sister. Clara understood immediately and asked if I wanted her to contact my sister. I blinked, yes. She stepped into the hallway and made the call. By the time Savannah arrived, Brandon had gone home to rest. Savannah held my hand and sobbed quietly until Clara explained the blink test. We started with simple words: credit, freeze. Together we spelled instructions: close card, remove Brandon, stop payments. Clara understood first, Savannah understood next. They worked like a small army built of quiet determination, because everything Brandon controlled could be undone in measured legal steps. Savannah called the bank from the corner of the room, speaking low so the staff would not interfere. She explained that I was the account holder and that a family member was acting with written authorization. Clara stood beside her and confirmed my condition. The bank paused 3 recurring payments linked to purchases that had nothing to do with my care. Later that afternoon, Savannah called the credit card company to remove Brandon's access as an authorized user. She forwarded copies of receipts that showed how many charges were filed under his business expenses. Nothing about the process was illegal. It was method and proof, small, precise steps. While Savannah worked the phone, Brandon returned. He saw her and tried to hug her with dramatic concern, but she stiffened and stepped back. He asked why she was there. She told him she came to read to me to help keep my mind awake. He pretended to welcome the help. When the nurse brought in water, Brandon asked another question about withdrawal of care, calling it a humane choice. Clara responded firmly that no decisions were being discussed. He nodded, but his jaw tightened. He left the room and called someone from the hallway. His voice carried through the wall. He said things were moving too slowly and the doctor was being difficult. He said costs would climb if they waited. He said funerals were expensive and families needed to be practical. I blinked at the ceiling and remembered every moment he had dismissed my work, my value, my voice. Now he was counting the price of my exit. Savannah returned to my bedside and whispered that no one was taking me anywhere. She said I was not alone. She said she saw the signs now, every red flag I had ignored. Clara set a small whiteboard near my bed and wrote, "You are safe." I blinked in agreement because safety was a new word in my world. For 4 days, I lived in a dark tunnel filled with betrayal and beeping monitors. On the 5th day, my sister read me a poem she wrote as a teenager. On the 6th day, Clara adjusted the letterboard and asked if I wanted to keep gathering evidence. I blinked yes. We spelled one sentence: "Do not tell him." Savannah squeezed my hand. Brandon returned that night with flowers and a plastic smile. He told me the hospital smelled sterile and that I would hate being trapped here. He said recovery sometimes meant letting go. He spoke to me like I was already gone. But he did not know that the silent room now held more than grief. It held a witness. It held my sister. It held a nurse who believed me. Quiet justice does not roar. It whispers until someone listens. The dark tunnel had cracks of light, now thin but real, and I was not done. Evening settled over the ICU like a low tide, and the machines kept time while the rain finally eased, and in that hush I felt the room tighten as footsteps approached, and Brandon walked in with Kayla at his shoulder, both of them smelling like cold air and expensive soap. Both of them arranging their faces into concern for anyone who might be watching. Nurse Clara adjusted my monitor and told them I was resting, and then she stepped to the sink to refill the pitcher with water. Brandon waited until her back was turned, leaned close to my bed, and said in a low, bright voice that sounded like a rehearsal Bali before or after the funeral, and Kayla bit her lip to stifle a laugh and whispered that the penthouse calendar had open dates in November and that the view over the stadium would be perfect for New Year fireworks. My chest tightened and the monitor ticked faster. Brandon glanced at the numbers with false sympathy and set his hand on the rail as if to steady me. He told Kayla the life insurance process was simple. He said the number like a lottery call, 2 million. And he said the agent already had a draft of the listing for the house, if we could get photos in the next week while things were still tidy. Kayla nodded and said the stager would bring white flowers and clean lines to sell the narrative of Fresh Start. When she said sell the narrative, my body tried to rage and could only tremble under the blanket. Brandon checked the hallway and then spoke into his phone a fast update for someone whose silence meant agreement. He said the doctor had used the phrase minimal brain response and that we should not let this stretch longer than necessary. He said there was no point in suffering. He said numbers again, 30 days for the policy, a week for the listing, 3 days to sort donations. Every digit he spoke sounded like a nail being counted before a lid closed. Clara turned back from the sink with the pitcher in her hands, and her eyes took everything in the shape of Brandon's mouth. Kayla's shining excitement, my racing heart. She set the pitcher beside the plastic cup, offered a gentle smile, and said she needed to swap out a sensor and it would be easier if the room stayed quiet for a minute. Brandon agreed and stepped back toward the window. As he did, Clara shifted the pitcher a few inches, the tiniest domestic gesture, and her other hand slid her phone into the shadow behind it, with a motion so smooth it looked like nothing at all. She met my eyes and laid her palm on the rail, then went about the soft choreography of checking tubes and lines, all of it the same as before, except now I could hear the faintest hum from behind the pitcher, and I understood. Kayla reached for Brandon's sleeve and whispered that when she is gone, we will finally exhale. Brandon exhaled on cue. He said, when she is gone, we will get 2 million. We can breathe. We can move. We can be done with the wait. The words were plain and heavy, and the room caught them. Clara did not react. She changed a dressing with precise hands and asked if they wanted the chaplain to stop by her voice, the even tone of a woman who has learned to listen until the truth walks out of its own mouth. Brandon shook his head and said they would keep things private. He tucked his phone away and leaned over me with his most loyal expression and told me he loved me and that a dignified farewell was sometimes the kindest choice. He said the house would help others if we sold it. He said my clothes could be donated where they would do good. He said the ring might go to someone who would wear it every day. He constructed a benevolent story while his eyes slid to Kayla, and then they fell into a comfortable silence, the way people do when they have already finished the hard part in their minds and are simply waiting for paperwork to catch up. Clara finished her checks and asked Brandon to sign a routine form at the nurse's station. He followed, and Kayla stayed scrolling her phone and whispering prices for flights and dates that lined up with open houses. I stared at the picture and prayed the little lens behind it had heard what I heard. When they returned, Clara moved the picture again with the same quiet grace and wished them a calm evening. After they left, she stood by my bed and said in a whisper, "I heard enough. Blink once for yes." I blinked once and felt something inside me harden into a steady line. She promised to keep me safe and to share what mattered with the right people. Then she asked if there was anything I needed to do now. I blinked toward the letterboard and she brought it close. Savannah had been waiting in the family lounge. Clara called her in and my sister hurried to my side with eyes that already knew something had shifted. We spelled with a rhythm we had learned in the last 24 hours. Devices. Return, receipts. She understood. I added more. iCloud, lock, change passwords, remove access. She wrote it down in a neat column like an action list for a school project and then pulled a folder from her tote that held the purchase receipts I had sent her months ago when I first started saving evidence. I spelled again. Watch, phone, laptop, earbuds, charger. All of it purchased by me in the good days when I thought equipping a husband meant investing in our life. Now each item was a lever. Savannah nodded and left the room to make calls. Clara hovered near the door and returned to the picture for a breathless second, sliding the phone out and into her pocket with one movement and a glance that told me it was all there. Minutes later, Savannah came back with a small smile that held relief and steel. She said the carrier had removed his device from my shared plan, said the cloud account was locked with a new key, said the passwords were changed and the recovery email rerouted to one I controlled. She said a courier would pick up the laptop and the watch from the house first thing in the morning using the receipts as authorization to reclaim property purchased by me. She said there would be a mess in his calendar by sunrise and that he would have to rebuild it without my accounts. It was not illegal. It was not petty. It was a clean correction. The items would be secured for litigation and nothing more. I lay there and listened to the oxygen whisper while the scales in my mind finally shifted by a measurable weight. Brandon believed he owned the timeline. He believed he owned my silence. Tonight he had given up both without noticing, and the proof of his intent now lived in a file that Clara would place into careful hands before dawn. The tunnel was still dark, but for the first time it had rails, and I felt the car of my life start to move in a different direction, with a click so quiet only the people who were truly listening could hear it. Morning broke with gray light sliding across the floor of my ICU room as if the world itself was holding its breath. Nurse Clara checked my vitals and whispered that today mattered. She said Dr. Patel had arranged a care conference for 2 in the afternoon, and that Brandon believed it was about prognosis and withdrawal. In reality, it was the first tile in a careful row of justice. Savannah returned just after breakfast with files tucked under her arm and eyes sharp with purpose. She read emails aloud in a low voice to Clara, messages pulled from Kayla's account that lined up the future like a travel brochure. There were Maui tickets on hold a post-payout timeline marked in heart emojis and an agent in Lodo waiting to list the house as soon as photos were taken. They discussed the policy amount as if it were a coupon. Every word landed like ash in my chest. Clara stepped out and returned with 2 men in plain clothes who handed her a small pouch. Detectives Morales and Carter spoke calmly to Dr. Patel in the hallway and then came into my room. They stood by my bed and introduced themselves gently as if talking to someone fully awake. They said they had heard enough to open a criminal investigation and that the recordings from last night were only the beginning. They asked if I could keep still when Brandon returned. I blinked once. They nodded. Morales placed a tiny recorder under the seam of Dr. Patel's coat, and Carter slid another into the pocket of Clara's scrubs. 2 officers waited outside disguised as hospital volunteers. No one raised their voice. No one made dramatic moves. Justice works best when it breathes quietly. Around noon, Naomi Brooks arrived. She was the attorney my family contacted for emergency representation. She spoke to Clara and Savannah about legal holds and civil claims. She told them that as long as I was conscious and responding to commands through blink communication, I had rights. She asked Savannah if I wanted to freeze all transactions related to my estate. I blinked hard. That was yes. Naomi drafted a litigation hold letter. It went to the insurance company, the mortgage broker, and the real estate agent involved in the Lodo condo conversation. Once those letters were filed, no one could move $1 or sign a listing without risking sanctions. Money hooks became leverage, and leverage became oxygen. The nurse adjusted my pillow and told me I had to let my body look as unresponsive as before. Any stronger movement might give Brandon reason to change tactics. I understood the cruel irony. To save my life, I had to pretend there was nothing left in me at all. An hour passed. Machines beeped. Voices murmured beyond the curtain. The world turned slowly. Around 1:40, Dr. Patel returned and stood near my bed rehearsing the medical script. Brandon and Kayla were on their way. Savannah stayed behind a privacy divider with notes and a copy of the receipts she used to reclaim my property the night before. The door slid open and Brandon entered with a solemn face. He thanked the doctor for making time to speak. He said he wanted to consider the most compassionate path. Kayla stayed near the window and scrolled on her phone, bored. Dr. Patel explained that the swelling in my brain could take days to resolve, and that sometimes patients surprised everyone. Brandon nodded, then said, "Sometimes we need to accept reality." His voice trembled the way insincere men often tremble when they practice grief instead of feeling it. The doctor asked if he had discussed final decisions with family. Brandon said the only family that mattered was here and gestured toward the woman who planned to take my place. Clara stood on my other side, her hands folded calmly, her recorder catching every breath. Brandon stepped closer to my bed and reached for my wrist. His thumb rubbed my skin as if he were soothing someone he loved. He whispered that letting go was peaceful, that prolonging suffering was cruel. He spoke loud enough for the recorder to hear. Then he asked again about time frames. He wanted to know how soon a death certificate was issued. He wanted to know what paperwork a beneficiary needed to claim funds. Kayla asked about house keys and whether funeral donations could include furniture. She said donating made things easier. Dr. Patel asked her to step back. She rolled her eyes. Savage relief rolled through my mind. Every careless sentence tied another knot in the rope of their guilt. Brandon turned to the doctor and asked a final question. If she goes soon, will the policy release quickly? The doctor answered that everything depended on the investigation. Investigation, Brandon repeated, confused. Dr. Patel explained gently that when a car's brakes fail, especially after recent service protocol, sometimes required a mechanical review. The scrub's pocket recorder caught the silence that followed. Kayla's hand froze around her phone. Brandon's shoulders tensed. He asked why anyone would investigate. He said accidents happened. The doctor said insurance companies liked certainty. Brandon swallowed and looked at me as if I had somehow betrayed him by surviving. Clara reached for the pitcher on the table and poured water into the cup, a tiny signal that the trap was ready. The officers outside the door stepped closer. Naomi was in a conference room across the hall preparing documents for a civil suit. The hallway filled with a quiet hum of justice ripening. Time stretched and the machines hummed. Brandon forced a smile and said they trusted the process, but his voice cracked on the word trust. Kayla's phone vibrated and she whispered something about wanting to leave. Brandon told her to be patient. He said everything would resolve soon. He said when she is gone, we will have 2 million reasons to start a better life. This time, the recorder caught every syllable clearly. That was the moment when the world tilted toward truth. I stayed still. My heart pounded. My chest wanted to rise in fury, but my body would not allow it. Good. The stillness made the evidence impossible to ignore. Savannah stepped forward just long enough to place a hand on the rail near my shoulder. She told the doctor she was grateful for transparency. She told Brandon she was writing down his responses to keep family records. The words family records made him look at her with suspicion, but he could not argue without revealing the lie of his grief. The hour moved with measured grace, and every breath I took was one closer to justice. Before they left, Naomi's letters were delivered electronically to every office that mattered. Transactions froze like ice. The policy could not be touched. The listing could not proceed. The Maui tickets would remain in limbo. I watched Brandon gather his coat and walk out of the room. He thought the worst was over. He thought tomorrow would bring closure and checks and a new life. He did not know the sting was already set. He did not know the next knock would not be from a funeral home. It would be from police with evidence pulled from his own mouth. The day was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet container of truth and patience. And when quiet justice grows, it does not bend. It waits. At exactly 2 p.m, the room filled with the soft shuffle of shoes and the disciplined calm of people who already knew what was about to happen. Dr. Patel entered first, his face arranged into professional neutrality, and he invited Brandon to sit. Kayla stood near the window again with her phone ready, as if this were merely another box to check before the life she wanted finally opened. The machines breathed for me with steady rhythm, and I kept my body as still as ice, pretending to be unaware of the knife hanging above us. Dr. Patel began by reviewing my condition. He said swelling was still present but not definitive, that time could change outcomes, that nothing required panic. Brandon nodded with bored politeness and asked the question he meant to ask: how long after removing life support would the insurance company release funds? His voice slipped eager, unguarded, like a child waiting for a prize. A hush fell over the room. Even Kayla glanced up. Dr. Patel placed his hands in the pockets of his coat and asked calmly why he was so concerned about timing. Brandon stuttered and said families needed to plan, expenses were high, funerals were costly. The doctor tilted his head and replied that cost was only one part of the investigation. He said it gently, the way a teacher might speak before revealing a surprise test. Brandon blinked. Investigation, he repeated as if the word were foreign. The doctor explained that police were already reviewing the vehicle because brake failure, after recent service, raised red flags. Kayla's phone slipped a little in her hand. Brandon's complexion drained of color until he matched the hospital sheets. He opened his mouth to deny everything, but his tongue could not form the right lie. That was when Detectives Morales and Carter stepped into the doorway, no longer disguised as volunteers. Their voices were steady and precise. They asked Brandon to remain where he was. They said they needed to play something for him and for the record. Clara moved closer to the picture where she had hidden the phone the night before. Morales held up a small speaker and pressed play. The recording spilled into the room with terrible clarity. "When she is gone, we will get $2 million. Brandon's own voice said, confident and greedy. "We can breathe, we can move, we can be done with the wait." Kayla's laugh followed, and the words penthouse and Maui and donation of clothes piled like debris after a storm. Brandon stood frozen eyes darting around the room as if searching for a script that could save him. The doctor did not blink. Savannah folded her arms and stared at the man who had nearly turned her sister into a paycheck. Kayla backed away from the bed shaking and whispered that she never meant anything, that she was just talking. Morales paused the audio and asked Brandon if he wanted to make a statement. Brandon tried to speak, but his throat closed. He said it was dark humor, stress, grief talking. The detective pressed play again this time, capturing the part where Brandon asked about withdrawal timeframes and the phrase "when she goes soon." There was no way to twist the meaning. The silence after the recording felt like thunder. Morales stepped forward and informed Brandon he was under arrest for attempted murder and insurance fraud. Carter placed cuffs on his wrists. Brandon burst into frantic pleading. He said it was a mistake. He said he loved me. He said he was overwhelmed. No one moved to comfort him. The machines kept breathing for me, and the sound repeated like a quiet verdict. Kayla tried to slip toward the hallway, but a uniformed officer blocked her path and told her she was being detained for questioning. She burst into tears. She said she did not know anything. The officer read her rights anyway. While this unfolded, I stared at Brandon, the man who had called himself my husband. His face twisted with anger and fear, as if he finally realized I was not gone, not silent, not his victim. For the first time since the crash, I blinked deliberately, a slow, controlled movement. His eyes snapped to mine. My blink was not random. It was choice. It was power. It was the first no I had spoken in weeks. He stuttered my name. He asked if I could hear him. I blinked again, and a tear formed at the corner of my eye. But this time, it was not from grief. It was from victory blooming inside a body he thought was broken. The officers led him out of the room while he looked over his shoulder again and again, like a man trying to outrun his own words. Kayla followed, trembling and silent, her luxury bag swinging uselessly from her wrist. When the door shut and the hallway swallowed them, the room felt different. It felt lighter. It felt honest. Dr. Patel exhaled and shook his head. Clara put her hand on my arm and whispered that it was over the worst of it anyway. Savannah leaned down and kissed my forehead. She told me justice had taken root and nothing would stop it now. The officers stayed outside to guard the evidence and protect me from any last desperate attempt. The hospital staff who once pitied Brandon now spoke about him with quiet disgust. The world had flipped its axis, and the truth stood upright. I lay there, breathing borrowed air, and tasted the first hint of freedom. It would not be fast, it would not be easy, but justice was moving, and it was moving for me. My heart slowed to a steady beat. I was no longer prey. I was witness. I was survivor. I was the voice they tried to erase. Conflict justice settled into the room like a final note in a long, unfinished song. Revenge emotional did not need screaming or chaos. Story financial would unfold in courtrooms and frozen accounts, and public records no one could ignore. When the doctor finished his report, he paused at my bedside and said softly, "You did everything right." Savannah laughed through tears and said, "Ariana always does." Hours later, when the room was quiet again, Clara wrote on a small card and taped it to the rail. "You won." And beneath it, in tiny letters, she wrote, "If you want the trial and karma to play out, blink twice later, and I will tell the rest." I blinked twice. Quiet justice is not loud. Silent revenge is not messy. It is dignity over money and truth that stands without apology. That is how the tide turned. 2 weeks after the arrest, the world outside my ICU room had transformed into a network of lawyers, detectives, and paper trails that no amount of denial could undo. Savannah visited every morning and read updates from Naomi and the police. She held the letterboard for me and spelled each development with steady patience. The first breakthrough came from the forensics team. They examined my car in a secured lab and confirmed that the brake line had been partially severed in a precise location where a clean slice would not fail immediately, but would weaken under pressure. The detectives said it was the kind of cut someone would make if they wanted the brakes to appear fine during short drives but collapse on the highway. Even worse, a scrapyard camera 3 weeks before the crash caught Brandon practicing on a junked SUV bending under its frame with a toolkit and gloves, then driving away without looking back. When the detectives played the footage for Naomi, she told the prosecutor it was a gift. There was no argument left for coincidence. Brandon's public defender tried to suggest stress, grief, and financial confusion. It did not work. Evidence had turned his intentions into a roadmap. While the investigation rolled forward, Kayla faced her own avalanche. She had lawyered up quickly and claimed she did not know anything, but detectives pulled deleted emails from her cloud backup. One message titled "Post-Payout Timeline" made the prosecutor's eyebrows lift. It laid out the sale of the house, the closing date for the policy, and a trip to Maui by December. When she realized she could not run from that, she asked for a plea deal. In exchange for a lesser charge, she handed over everything, including a voice note Brandon recorded after a call with the insurance agent. In the note, he set a date for withdrawing life support and said the house would need photos before the holiday rush. He laughed about staging my closet and donating my clothes so buyers could imagine the space as their own. The prosecutor called the voice note chilling. Savannah called it stupid. Clara printed it, placed it in a folder, and tucked it into the drawer beside my bed like a trophy. In the middle of this storm, my body began to move again first, with the slightest twitch in my fingers, then a weak stretch of my toes. Physical therapists visited daily. They lifted my limbs, encouraging my muscles to wake. My recovery felt slow, but every inch mattered because it meant I would not be silent during the trial. It also meant I could start directing my own small, satisfying consequences. Mini revenge was real and legal. Through the letterboard, I instructed Savannah to cancel every family subscription that had been billed to my accounts. Every channel, every premium service, every automatic renewal that Brandon used without thinking. One by one, they vanished. The gym membership closed. The golf club access revoked. Streaming services locked. His cloud account scrambled without my authorization. Savannah showed me the confirmation emails and smiled. She called it housekeeping for the soul. The house itself remained untouched. A judge issued a protective order freezing all marital property. The $2 million insurance policy froze too. The joint accounts froze. Every credit card linked to me paused. Brandon's life, once fueled by entitlement, stalled like a dead engine in winter. Even from my hospital bed, I could feel the ripple of control shifting. Meanwhile, Naomi filed a civil claim for punitive damages. She said attempted murder for financial gain deserved more than prison. She said survivors deserved restitution and dignity. Court paperwork became a shield, and every form built a wall. Brandon could not climb. Reporters started calling the police station. Words like insurance plot and brake tampering circulated. The hospital staff whispered about the case in the cafeteria. Families visiting loved ones walked past my room more slowly, as if they knew the woman inside had survived something unimaginable. Some nurses left small post-it notes with drawings of hearts and messages like, "Keep fighting." Recovery was brutal, but I was not alone. During week 3, the detectives brought final results. The brake tool found in Brandon's garage matched the cut pattern on my car. His internet searches included how long after death insurance pays and how to disable anti-lock brakes. The prosecutor almost smiled when she said juries did not like spreadsheets of murder plans. Kayla had already signed her plea and was prepared to testify. She described conversations where Brandon said life would be easier without my bills and my slow career. He had compared me to deadweight, his words, not hers. She handed over screenshots of messages where he told her to be patient, that the policy was generous, and that my kindness had built their future. The phrase, "my kindness," made Naomi close her eyes for a long moment. Then she filed a motion to freeze Brandon's retirement funds for restitution. The judge approved it faster than anyone expected. Week 4 brought a different kind of peace. My hands could grip the rail of my bed. My voice came back in a fractured whisper, enough to speak my own name. Clara cried when she heard it. Savannah kissed my forehead and told me I was stronger than steel. When Brandon's lawyer tried to request supervised contact, the judge denied it. The police documented every threat Brandon had implied. His access to me was over forever. As fall deepened, leaves turned the streets of Denver red and gold. Outside the window, families walked their dogs and drank spiced coffee. Life kept moving, and I moved with it inch by inch. Revenge emotional was not dramatic. It was methodical and calm. Conflict justice unfolded in forms filings and frozen assets. Story financial became evidence on paper. Every step led toward trial. The prosecutor told Naomi the case was solid. He said juries listen when greed tries to bury love. In the 6th week after the crash, a hospital administrator delivered a letter. It came from the insurance company. The litigation hold prevented Brandon from filing any claim. They also flagged the policy for fraud review. In simple words, it meant he would never touch a cent. Naomi read the letter aloud, and everyone exhaled. That was money he built his dreams on, and now it was a locked vault. When night came, Clara dimmed the lights and whispered that justice has long legs, slow but steady. I closed my eyes and breathed on my own for 3 full seconds before the machine assisted again. That tiny breath was the loudest victory of all. The world outside might only see a woman in a hospital bed, but I knew my life had already been reclaimed, piece by piece, with patience sharper than any blade. Quiet justice does not rush. It simply waits until every lie collapses under its own weight. 8 months later, the air outside Denver District Court tasted like cold metal and spring wind, the kind that carries both endings and beginnings. And when Savannah helped me out of the car, I stood on my own feet with a cane in my right hand and my mother's earrings in my ears, tiny silver drops that made me feel protected. Reporters lined the steps, but the officers guided us through a side entrance past marble hallways and into a courtroom where everything smelled of furniture, polish, and paper. Brandon sat at the defense table in a suit that looked too big for him, wrists exposed, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Kayla, smaller than I remembered, sat behind her lawyer with her hands folded as if prayer could erase evidence. The prosecutor arranged exhibits on a long table, every item a piece of the truth that tried to kill me. First came the recording from the ICU, played slowly every syllable of greed, echoing through the courtroom. When she is gone, we will get 2 million. We can breathe. We can move. We can be done with the wait. Jurors shifted, some in disbelief, some in disgust. Next came the salvage yard footage, Brandon crouched under a wrecked SUV practicing cuts on its brake line. Then screenshots of Kayla's post-payout timeline, the condo email, the Maui tickets, the staged donation list for my clothes. Dr. Patel testified with calm authority. Nurse Clara spoke with quiet precision, describing how she discovered my ability to hear and spelled words with me on the letterboard. She told the jury how my tears had not been reflex, how they were a silent scream. The defense tried to paint Brandon as overwhelmed and confused, but when they questioned his mother, Elaine, she refused to shield him. She said she loved her son but would not lie for him. She said Ariana was a good woman. She stepped down with shaking hands and would not look at Brandon. That moment struck harder than any recorded proof, because even the woman who raised him could not defend what he had done. During a recess, a group of my former students slipped into the courtroom. They carried letters. One by one, they handed them to Naomi, who passed them to the judge. The letters described a teacher who stayed late to tutor, who bought lunch for kids, who forgot money, who believed in them when no one else did. The jurors read them, and their expressions softened into sorrow and anger. When testimony ended, the prosecutor called me forward for my victim impact statement. I walked slowly, cane tapping against the floor each step, a declaration that I was alive by my own will. The courtroom fell quiet. I looked at Brandon. He stared at the table, unable to meet my eyes. When I spoke, my voice shook at first, but then it steadied, thin but unbroken. I told the jury that a quiet heart is still a heart, that a silent body is still a soul. I said my life was not a price tag or a policy. I said dignity over money, because greed is loud, but justice does not need volume. The judge listened without blinking. The prosecutor watched like someone holding a torch over darkness. The clerk recorded every word. Brandon finally looked up, his face pale, but there was no apology in his eyes, only fear. He spoke next through his attorney, pleading not guilty, claiming stress, confusion, and emotional collapse. The jury did not believe him. They returned in less than 3 hours. Guilty of attempted first-degree murder, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of conspiracy. The judge sentenced him to 30 years, no early release, no sympathy. Kayla received 8 years for her role for silence that became participation. When the gavel fell, the room breathed out. I exhaled with it. Savannah wrapped her arm around me and whispered that this was the moment I got my name back. As the bailiffs led Brandon away, he turned toward me the way a man might turn toward a ghost. He opened his mouth to speak, but words collapsed under the weight of his sentence. The doors closed behind him, and I felt the world shift. Not loud, not triumphant, steady, real. Standing up for yourself does not mean shouting. Sometimes it is simply staying alive long enough to watch the truth stand taller than the lie. Reclaiming respect happens in courtrooms and hospital beds and the quiet corners of the soul where fear once lived. Revenge through truth is not about hate, it is about closure that leaves no stain on your own hands. When we stepped outside the courthouse, the sunlight hit my face and I lifted my chin to meet it. Reporters asked questions, but I did not speak. Savannah answered with dignity. She said justice had been served. She said her sister fought from a silent prison and won. Later that night, Clara called and told me she cried when she heard the verdict. Naomi sent a final document confirming the civil judgment punitive damages and frozen assets that would ensure Brandon never profited from his plan. It was not gloating. It was balance. That night, I sat by my window and watched Denver lights flicker like small promises. I thought about every woman who has been dismissed, silenced, ignored. I thought about every family betrayal disguised as love, every story financial built on lies, every life nearly taken because someone believed they were entitled to freedom bought with death. Justice came because I lived long enough to speak again. Quiet justice, silent revenge, dignity over money. If you want the lesson in betrayal and truth and closure, if you want to hear how life rebuilt itself after the verdict, type Justice and I will show you the epilogue. 2 years after the verdict, the city looked different, even though the streets were the same, and the mountains still guarded Denver like quiet giants. Healing is slow work, the kind that never appears dramatic from the outside, but every morning I woke up and felt my lungs expand on their own. I remembered that survival is a kind of daily victory. Craig Hospital in Englewood became a second home, a place where I learned to trust my legs again, where a physical therapist named June taught me how to walk without fear. She never treated me like a fragile thing. She said strength returns when the body remembers who it belongs to, and slowly my muscles listened. First 10 steps, then 50, then across a hallway without anyone holding my arm. By summer, I could climb stairs. By fall, I could drive again. The DMV clerk looked at the medical clearance and asked if I wanted a new photo. I said yes because the woman in the old one was gone. I returned to teaching full-time at the middle school. When I walked into my classroom on the first day back, the students clapped, awkward and sweet, and someone had taped a banner over the whiteboard that said, "Welcome back, Ms. Cole." For the first time in a long time, I felt like the world saw me for who I really was. Every Thursday, I stayed after school to tutor kids whose parents worked late. Some of them asked about the cane about the scar near my hairline, and I told them healing makes us stronger, and kindness makes us powerful. One afternoon, the principal called me into her office and handed me a grant to start a small scholarship fund for students who struggled with school costs. I named it the Cherry Creek Promise and donated the first $1,000 myself because karma works both ways. When I moved out of the house where Brandon and I once lived, I did it without ceremony. Savannah and I packed boxes quietly, and a cleaning crew handled the rest. I sold the house to a young couple who had a baby on the way and used the proceeds to buy a modest townhome in Park Hill with a little garden and windows that pulled in the morning light. The inspection report included a detailed brake check on my car. I read every line twice. Peace sometimes looks like paperwork. Letters began arriving from the prison where Brandon served his sentence. At first he demanded things. Then he begged. Then he apologized. He asked for help with an appeal and said he was a changed man. He said he still loved me. He asked for mercy. I read each letter once and placed it in a folder marked "No Response." Kayla wrote too. She asked for a letter of leniency that might shorten her sentence. She said she regretted everything and that she prayed for my forgiveness. I did not write back. Instead, I printed a photo of the ICU recording transcript and a copy of the sentencing order, stapled them together, and mailed them with a single sentence written in neat black ink. Justice served. That was mini revenge number 9. Small, clean, legal. Enough. On weekends, I rode my bike on Cherry Creek Trail and passed families with strollers and dogs chasing leaves. The rhythm of the pedals steadied my breathing, and every push forward reminded me that the world gives us more than it takes if we stay long enough to see it. One morning, an older woman stopped me when she recognized my face from the news. She hugged me gently and whispered that she had survived her own betrayal, and that my story helped her believe she could reclaim her life, too. We stood on the trail for a long moment in quiet solidarity. There is a kind of revenge, emotional, that does not involve anger. It is the laughter of someone who lived. It is the soft wind on your face when you realize fear no longer has a key to your house. It is the knowledge that Story Financial did not end with greed, but with a scholarship fund and a classroom full of bright voices. Sometimes I sit in my garden with a book and listen to the sounds of my neighborhood while flowers bloom in soft colors. Sometimes Clara visits and we drink tea and talk about the day she saw a tear and decided to believe it. She tells me nurses see the world in small miracles, and I tell her she was mine. Savannah stops by with her kids who chase each other through the yard and leave chalk drawings on my walkway. Life returned gently without ceremony, the way dawn returns after a long night. Revenge inheritance drama family turned into something quieter, not a war, not a spectacle, just balance, just peace. The past did not disappear, but it no longer sat at my table. Living well is the best revenge not because it punishes anyone, but because it frees you. If this story touched you, leave quiet justice in the comments and tell me where you are watching from. Share it so anyone who has lived through family betrayal can find truth and closure. Here we choose dignity over money. Silent revenge, but powerful, standing up for yourself, reclaiming respect. A lesson in betrayal and revenge through truth.